Welcome, everybody. And today we'll be talking to Paul Weller, who's another of our authors from the forthcoming book, Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Yeah, well, you said my name is Paul Weller. I'm a Christian in the Baptist tradition of Christianity, but with strong Roman Catholic connections through family as well. I'm currently living between Germany and the UK. I'm formally retired, as people say, from contracted work, but I have three roles in different, connected with different universities. I'm a research fellow in religion and society at Regent's Park College in Oxford, where I'm also associate director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture. I'm a visiting professor in the Centre for Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University, and an emeritus professor at the University of Derby, where I worked for most of my academic career.
Yeah, thank you. Could you briefly describe what your chapter's about?
Yes, well, it's called, it has the Coming Full Circle title, and that's maybe in a couple of ways, both kind of biographically from the 1970s, when I was a teenager, through to today. And in parallel with that kind of biographical exploration of how the themes of Christianity, empire, whiteness, and global majority intersect with each other, I explore that partly through my biographical reflections and engagements, but also, in a sense, the history of migrant and refugee struggles, particularly in the UK context over that 50 years. And kind of looking back on it, it's one of the things, I guess, as one gets older, it's possible to do. So the chapter sort of proceeds through what I've called an odyssey, through a quartet over time, because it uses four pieces of poetry or prose poetry writing, three by myself and one by my deceased German wife, to kind of, I guess, punctuate different parts of the story, and to provide a different kind of input than a more intellectually analytical one, something that gives a more personal exploration. So the chapter begins with a section on the inheritance of empire, which starts off basically with my context as a white Christian teenager growing up in Margate in the 1970s, where there was very little sense or presence of people from the global two-thirds world majority backgrounds. I wrote a poem at the time, though, because I had a sense, it's called Rule Britannia, because I had a sense of the ending of something starting or coming through in that period. It was perhaps a rather more fin de siècle idea of ending of empire than anything politically analytical. But I had this sense, it's captured in one of the lines of the poem T.S. Eliot wrote in his poetry about, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. And I kind of thought, is that the end of the British Empire? Not with a bang, but a whimper. So that was the kind of starting point. And then from there, it goes into another section, which I've entitled Outside and Inside Perspectives on the Empire Within. Now, this marks the start, I guess, of what could be called my conscientization process in relation to these issues. Some of that came about through reading. Some of that came about through engagement with people and my own increasing involvement, and then out of that into activisms of various kinds. So what made a big impression on me in that early 1980s period, Salman Rushdie wrote this essay called The New Empire Within Britain. And it was a very challenging essay which spoke that its inhabitants of this new empire will be obliged to struggle against the white majority if injustices continue. Also, I was very struck by something that Shivanandan wrote in a very powerful pamphlet, White Man Listen, which followed the New Cross fire and the deaths of black young people in that. Our history is not your history, he writes, addressing white people. And those challenges started, I guess, to make me think seriously, in conjunction then with involvements that I also began to have through the local council of churches. I got to know of local families in the Tameside area of Greater Manchester where I was living who were either divided as a result of the immigration laws in place at that time and or were facing deportation from the UK. And as I got to know these people as individuals and as families, I was impacted by the injustice of their experience, and then started to ask questions beyond the individual experiences of the system that lay behind that. And I became increasingly involved in all of that, and in what was then in that period started to be known as the sanctuary movement, where asylum seekers, refugees, migrants who were under threat of deportation, we organised in churches, mosques, gurdwaras, temples, for people to take sanctuary as both as a support to those individuals and families who were being challenged, but also as a means of focusing and critiquing the system that was giving rise to those experiences. So that was the next phase in the book, which is punctuated also by a poem that my deceased German wife wrote at that time, Love Song. She came to live with me in the UK. She very much loved England in many of the nice things about England, the images of England that people have. But through our experiences, she had, in a way, her eyes opened to what lay beneath the cups of tea and the steaming crumpets, as she put it in the poem. And in fact, she very challengingly identified what she called Goebbels talk in the UK, in a way that many people found very overstated. Many white people found overstated at the time. But then at the end of this section, where I then explore fast forward to, well, you know, that language, perhaps when one looks at, for example, the Rwanda plan of the present government, it's not so far removed, especially when one considers that Nazi Germany also in 1940 had a so-called Madagascar plan, which was about removing Jewish people out of occupied France in collaboration with the Vichy government to the island of Madagascar. And there are some, you know, eerie echoes of that. And so I explore some of that because that's also part of the bridge of my kind of now British-German interface. And then the next section of the chapter comes, it's called Full Circle to Brexit, because, and it starts off with a poem that I wrote soon after the advisory referendum decision on Brexit. And in reflecting on all of that, later I've called Brexit a colonial boomerang in a populist world, because I think if one looks at the entire colonial history of the UK, one has to see that what's called the UK, the United Kingdom, is in itself the product of a colonial project, and most notably in relation to Ireland in history. And, you know, it's no accident that what's come out of Brexit has been a lot of conflict and difficulty and issues also around how Ireland, the island of Ireland, both the Republic and Northern Ireland, fit into that whole post-Brexit picture. So in common with Anthony Reddie, for example, and his book on theologizing Brexit, liberationist and post-colonial critique, I think there's a lot that reveals about British colonialism through the pathway towards Brexit the vote around it, and also its aftermath. And the failure in the UK really to systematically practice what in some ways in Germany has been done, though not to a full extent, what they call in one of the long German words, Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, in other words, working on one's history, which in the light of the Holocaust of Jewish and other people, German society has necessarily had to do. It's been confronted with that in a way in which it was impossible, broadly speaking, for the society to ignore that, whereas the terrors and the systematic and industrial scale, for example, of the transatlantic slave trade is not something which British society as a whole has managed to go about doing this Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, but is needed. But Brexit, in a way, clouds over all that. And it indeed creates its own set of additional issues, which in the final section of the chapter I called Towards Windrush on Steroids. That's picking up on the former chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Yvette Cooper, having spoken about that potential coming out of noting, of course, what's happened to people of African Caribbean descent in Britain, suddenly 20 years on, finding themselves without a legal status, apparently, and the lack of remedy still for that. But thinking now what might happen to the 5-6 million EU citizens who were in the UK at the time of Brexit. And of course, in the past, these things have been kind of divide and rule. So, okay, most of the EU citizens are also white citizens, but there is perhaps potential out of this experience for which I think is one of the greatest traumas that's happened in Europe until the Ukraine war happened, following the Second World War, because it affects so many millions of people in terms of their rights to live, work, travel, love, marry, who, etc. In the same way that I learned those things were the case for people of two-thirds world inheritance in the UK. I started learning that in the 80s and 90s and so on. But these things are also now happening in a different way, with a different justification, a different way of othering. But within that is perhaps also some kind of hopeful bridge, maybe, to revisiting and re-engaging with those issues which haven't gone away for other people, but are affecting, as I say, large numbers of EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU. So the chapter kind of concludes around that, and where I now live in Germany. It's not that I have a rose-tinted thing about Germany, not at all. And indeed, it isn't appeared in the chapter, but this weekend, the Alternative for Deutschland won their first local administrator position, and they're riding high at 20% in the polls here in Germany, which is a very concerning thing. And of course, colonialism was not only a British phenomenon. And one of the things sometimes that Germans, while they've done their Aufarbeitung on the history of the Holocaust, perhaps have not faced sufficiently, is, for example, the German colonial rule in what was then called German Southwest Africa, in which, of course, between 1904 and 1907, 80,000 indigenous people were killed by German troops, almost 80% of the Herero people and 50% of the Nama people. And often Germans look at the UK and critique for a colonialism that the UK has not come to terms with, rightly so. I think that critique, Brexit illustrates that. But not only in the UK, also in Germany, is that kind of history of colonialism, and not only in Germany, but also in a significant number of other European countries where maybe also the work has not been done on that Vergangenheitsarbeitung. Yeah. So that's roughly, the scope of the chapter in its kind of subtitles and what I'm trying to do in it in terms of exploration of the broader theme to which the chapter contributes in the book.
Thank you. So maybe you've touched on it already, but what made you take that approach?
Yeah, I think partly because I think it's important. I mean, I have always been a big believer that theology and biography have a lot of intertwining. That a theology that is worth its salt in any case should not be an intellectual exercise. So its engagement with one's sort of personal biography, reflection and journey is important. Also, very significantly towards that, its rooting in a context that's social and political. So I guess what I was trying to do in the chapter in terms of, if you like, overall approach was to interweave the personal and reflective with the intellectual and analytic, to interweave what gradually for me became an activist praxis in relation to particularly struggles around family unification and deportations, together with a developing intellectual analysis and critique of the legal system or the laws which bring that about. It's not these things take place through law. And that exploration, and then the interweaving of the UK context with the wider European context, in particular because of my kind of recent transitions more towards living in Germany, but also still living in the UK. That interweaving as well. So that's why the approach is as it is overall, and it takes that also over that period of kind of 50 years, looking back, I guess.
Thank you. I think you've also partly answered this, but I would like to ask you, what would you say has shaped your social conscience in terms of things like race and inclusivity?
Yeah, well, I think it's, I have largely, I think, referred to those things in what I've said so far. I mean, having grown up as I did in a context where I did, it was actually getting to know the experience of concrete individuals and families that was not my experience, was nowhere near part of my experience, of which I therefore had no real understanding. But the start of that, and then as a Christian, sensing the fundamental injustices involved, but then hopefully not stopping at that in terms of the individuals, but through the individual experience, opening up questions about why are things structured as they are, why are laws as they are, out of what inheritance and history do these things come? And that whole process, really, I guess, accompanying that process and trying my best to work through it, and what its implications would be for me, and what that means I should, as a Christian believer, as an activist, later on also as an academic, what responsibilities should I have in relation to these things? Yeah.
Thank you. So what do you think are the biggest challenges to the church and wider society in terms of creating frameworks for social justice?
Yeah, in terms of the church, towards the end of the chapter, I raised the whole issue of the Constantinian inheritance of the church, that the Christian church took a fateful turn in its history. And that fateful turn was to align itself with the powers that be in the Roman Empire at that time. And that fateful turn, I think, has had consequences that have gone right down throughout Christian history. And the biggest challenge, I would say, and opportunity, is about leaving behind Constantinianism, the need to do that. One of the Baptist theologians in my own Baptist Christian tradition, for example, he asked James McClendon Jr., he asked the question, how might it have been at that point in time? He said that if the Christian leaders had met at Nicaea not to anathematize each other's inadequate theological metaphysics, but rather to develop a strategy by which the church might remain the church. In other words, what he says they failed to do was to secure Christian social ethics before refining Christian dogma. And it's because of that that then missiologically, much of the, so to speak, Christian missiological package that came out from at least the Western world part of Christianity into the wider world was not only shaped by racialized thinking in relation to peoples who were encountered, but also by this whole power structure alliance, really, between religion and state, manifested in this whole Constantinian approach to the church. And that really has had its further consequences of making Jesus, so to speak, into almost claiming him as doctrinally the property of Christians, only to be accepted and engaged with in ways that other people are told to do so, rather than out of their freedom of response to the person of Jesus. And so it seems to me that the big challenge is, and it encompasses so many things and feeds into the inheritance of empire and of racism, is this challenge to, and the leaving behind of, and the confidence that actually one does not need this symbiotic Constantinianism for the church to live. Indeed, the church perhaps finds its path to liberation, those who both suffered under colonialism and those who've been part of the inheritance of colonialism, as this is left behind and a new way of being Christian together in the church is found, that can help therefore overcome both the combination of racialized thinking and of secular power that the structures of colonialism and imperialism have bequeathed to us, also through this Constantinian construct. So that seems to me to be a central challenge.
Okay, thank you. So to end, what do you hope people would get out of reading your chapter?
I would hope that at least white people reading it might be able to feel that it is possible for people without personal experience of what colonialism and imperialism means, it is possible to learn over a period of time. And that learning should also lead to a challenge of what to do with that knowledge when one becomes self-aware about it. And that one can try to ally with struggles. And I'd like to put one of the things I didn't mention actually in terms of what shaped my conscience. There's a little story which I'll maybe end with, which was about a sanctuary fast that we conducted in a local Baptist congregation in 1983. It was my first attempt at dipping my toes in the water as a pastor of a Baptist congregation in doing something that visibly and openly challenged the impact of immigration laws, differential impact on people. And we had a young Hindu man called Vinod Chan, and he lived with us in the church building just for a weekend. It wasn't a full-blown sanctuary of the kind that developed later. It didn't actually cost us a lot to do it, but it was a step that required a step and another step. And during this weekend sanctuary, a white working class woman who lived just across from the where the church building was, she came across the church and made what she called blood protest. So what she did was she took a piece of blotting paper, and we had like a screen up with campaign materials on and so on. She took 2 pieces of blotting paper, and she came with a needle and took the needle into her thumb and put her blood on the 1 piece of blotting paper. And then she took Vinod's thumb and took a needle, pricked it, and put his blood. And her point about this, which I describe really as an act of prophetic symbolism, there's no difference in the blood. She's saying there's no difference in the blood. So why do we make this difference? And she actually also expressed, in many ways, I think, in an unsophisticated way, but in a deeply profound way, what these days, I guess, are emerging, what's called critical whiteness studies and so on. But as a white working class woman, she said this, and I think it's a good note to kind of end on. She said, "We presume things because we want to think the things that we want to think. We only presume that God is white. We don't see him in any other color, but we don't know that he is." And that was her way of saying, through this engagement, she had come not only to see the injustice in relation to this individual and maybe also the system that lay behind it, but also the implications of that theologically for the way that white Christians have thought and acted against this inheritance, largely still not worked through, of colonialism and racism. So I think there's hope in that. And when that happened at the time, I was deeply moved by her example. And I think it made a profound impact on my life at a certain point in time, such that at the time I wrote a thing called The Problems of the White Ethnic Majority out of it. And a couple of years ago, I revisited that in an essay in practical theology. So yes, it is possible to change, and change can be brought about through engagement and honest reflection, and then trying to engage again in a different way.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for sharing your experiences and your insights with us today. And I'm sure people will look forward to reading your chapter.
And thank you for all your editorial work on the book.
You're welcome. Thank you.